Hello, I'm Bernard Ziegler, and I'm very pleased to be talking to you on the occasion of the 7th International Conference on Fuzzy Systems and Data Mining. I hope you find my talk on modeling and simulation for intelligent systems through perspective of neural modeling of cognitive behaviors interesting, and look forward to interacting with you after the talk. Thank you very much. Outline of the talk. Our goal is to connect simple cognitive behaviors to actual biological realizations. We focus on perception and generation of temporal event patterns. And we'll use discrete event system specification, the DEVS models, to exhibit such behaviors. And they can be developed so they can be simulated and their behavior observed and tested in computational form to make sure that the behavior is as expected, and in a sense approach to verification. And we'll review the basics of dynamic system theory underlying DEVS. Now, DEVS is an event-based formalism that is totally consistent with system theory of dynamic systems in general. But it focuses on the components and neural elements that are required, such as states, processing signals, and memory, as well as how to coordinate various neural elements in space and time, and more than currently discussed in neural nets. So we'll talk about the canonical minimal nature of our models, at least an example. Since this talk is focused on DEVS, discrete event system specification, let's take a moment to look at what DEVS refers to. It is a way to represent real systems, whether existing or hypothetical, so that they can be simulated on a computer. It's part of a framework and theory of modeling and simulation, and a unique way of constructing a simulation model that is based on a mathematical theory of systems. Let's do a quick introduction based on a tutorial recently composed. DEVS models complex dynamic systems using a discrete event abstraction. At this abstraction level, a time sequence of pertinent events is input to a system and causes instantaneous changes to the state of the system. These events can be generated externally, coming from another model, or internally within the model itself. The next state of a system is defined based on the previous state of the system and the event, whether external or internal. Simulation algorithms must only consider states at which events occur. They can skip over all intermediate points in time. This contrasts with discrete time models, where time is incremented with a fixed increment. Although DEVS is a formalism that has been derived from system theory, it has been developed over many years to be put into practice and to enable tools to express DEVS models in a form that then allows them to be simulated and employed in modeling and simulation environments to study in models in specific domains such as neurocognition and cyber-physical systems, which are the focus of today's talk. The idea is that this approach develops computationally aware uh, uh, models that are both mathematically justified and system theoretically derived. This differs from many approaches in which the models are developed in a simulation context and not distinguished structurally from the simulation and not derived from a underlying system theory. To give you a sense of how DEVS helps develop models for simulation and for analysis, it has two distinguished types of models. One is atomic models, in which you express the basic dynamics of a component of a system. Here we show how this is expressed in UML or in meta-modeling, where you have a time advance function, an output function, an internal transition function, and an external transition function. These then have to be expressed by the modeler, but in a form that may be much more friendly than a mathematical form. And eventually, an atomic model has input ports, output ports, and definition of the states, function for advancing time or giving the time that the model stays in a state, the internal transition that it takes after that state duration has elapsed, and an external transition function that tells it how to respond to inputs while it's in a certain state, and an output function that it produces when it makes transitions in the state. The other form of modeling is coupled models, in which atomic models are coupled together, where outputs are coupled into inputs. And this is shown in this UML set of packages that can be implemented in various ways. And the coupled model structure elements are the models that compose it, the input ports for the overall model and the output ports for the overall model, and the couplings between the input ports and the output ports that make up the model, both from external to internal. One more general slide before we talk about the application to behaviors in cognition. The theory of modeling and simulation has four components or elements: the experimental frame, the source system, the model, and the simulator. And we distinguish these four from each other and consider them separately and in their relation to each other to establish correct modeling and simulation experiment. The source system and the model are related through modeling relation, which the model is valid for the source system. It can replicate source system behavior, for example, but only required to be within the particular experimental frame or set of conditions under which the simulation is expected to be held. The model and the simulator are distinguished in that they're not necessarily in the same package, but the model is an independent entity, but defined in a way that it has a simulator. In the case of DEVS, a standard simulation algorithm for any DEVS model. And the idea is that a correct behavior generation by the simulator can be established with the simulation relation that in the DEVS case employs the definition of DEVS coupled model as a system theoretical entity to inform what the design of the simulator is. That are developed using mathematical system theory. And the minimal nature has implications for the structures that any plausible biological model of cognitive behavior must have within them. And then we'll talk a little bit about implications for intelligent cyber-physical system designs. Now let's consider our approach to linking cognitive behavior to neural circuits. We will use DEVS models and their minimal realizations of cognitive behaviors. So we start with cognitively relevant behavior or computation, and we'll define that as formulating an input-output function, let's call it beta. From this, we derive a DEVS model that can exhibit this behavior or generate this function using structural inference. And then we can go on to implement this model in network form and validate it with DEVS simulation. But the new idea here is that we try to show that the model itself is minimal in a well-defined sense of system theory that has smallest number of states. And what this implies is that any other implementation of the same behavior must in fact be a superimage, a homomorphic relationship to this minimal realization, which implies that any realization or implementation, biological or otherwise, must in fact have this at least this number of states and organized in this particular way. To proceed further, we'll have to set some of the definitions down, borrowed from Theory of Modeling and Simulation. A recent edition is 2018. We'll talk about levels of system specification. Each level is an approach to understanding what the system is as a black box in the beginning and increasingly adding more knowledge or information or specification as we go up the levels. So at the lowest level, we have the observation frame, which allows us to stimulate the system with inputs and measure its outputs and observe the time behavior in this way over a time base. So for example, we'll talk about elementary perception units, which we'll define, and they have as inputs these ports: activate, input event, and reset, and as output ports also activate and timeout. So this would be the observation frame and allows us to observe the system over time, which is what we'll be doing at the next levels. So at level 1, we'll talk about the input-output behavior, which is the time index data collected from a source system, and it consists of input-output pairs. In this case, two pairs with the same input may have different outputs. For example, if we have an activate event at this time and later an input event at this time, it may result in eventual activation, an activate event at this time. However, if the system is in a different state and we apply the same input segment, we may observe no output, which is a time segment with null events populating the complete interval. So as I mentioned, might be that the reason is that we were in different states when we did this experiment. So the next level accounts for being in different states, and that's the input-output function level. And that's at which we have the knowledge of initial state. So that given an initial state, every input stimulus produces a unique output. For example, one segment is then associated with one output segment is associated with an input segment because we have partitioned the pairs into groups according to the initial state the system was in when the input segment was started. So if we have the same input segment now, but we account for being in two different states, one being passive, and we've activated the system, another being in a working state, so that an activation has no effect, then we have these two different output segments that correspond with the same input segment, but we put them into different sets according to the state that the system started in. We continue on to the higher levels of system specification. At level 3, we talk about the state transition system. This concerns how states are affected by inputs. Given a state and an input, what is the state after the input is over? What output event is generated by such a state? For example, how a person transitions from state to state under receiving input words and generating output words from a current state. The next level has to do with the coupled component level or coupled models, where we talk about knowing the components that the system is resolved into and how they are coupled together. Components can be specified at lower levels or even be structure systems themselves structured at this level, which leads to hierarchical structure. For example, this level, we have a description of a person's input-output behavior in terms of neural components and their interaction by spikes. For example, now we consider the cognitive behavior temporal patterns that we'll be addressing. For example, these could be described in regular languages, but in our case, we're talking about them occurring over time, or real time, in a time base. So at level 3, we're talking about, say, the elementary perception unit in terms of its states and its transitions that are determined by responding to inputs and generating outputs. Now, at the next level, the coupled component level or coupled model level, we actually consider such a transition system as implemented by components, and the components are coupled together to realize the state transitions and inputs and output effects at the next level 3. And it's at this level that neural networks typically reside, and that the neurons are coupled together to realize the ultimate behavior. However, we could go into further resolution and consider breaking these components down further and looking at the possible internal components of neurons, or including other components that might be necessary to realize the behaviors that we're talking about at the higher levels. So this leads to models for brain architecture, and we'll see that the kinds of models we come up with have implications for, although they're at the lowest levels, the input-output behavior, the minimal realizations imply certain requirements for the ultimate architecture, so that this gives us clues as to what to look for in modeling the human brain or other animal brains. Let's now talk about inferring structure from behavior. For example, how can we show that an EPU as just defined is in fact the minimum realization of its behavior? Well, we have the hierarchy of levels of system specification, and we discussed that the information or knowledge about the system increases as we go up the levels. Uh, that means that actually there's a mapping from one level downward to the next, which is a multi-valent mapping, many to one uh, function systems at one level map to the same system at the lower level. So in fact, going up means that we are selecting from the set of possible uh, realizations of the, for example, the function at this level, the higher function level, many of the possible systems, one of them as being special or representing the real world or the one we want to design, and making that jump can be done with justifying conditions that allow us to make the upward transition. And in the case of realization at the input-output function level, we get a minimal realization. So the minimal realization is the system that realizes the function of interest. And all other systems are mapping into it necessarily. They have more states and have states organized in a way that there's a morphic relation, or mapping, a homomorphic mapping to the minimal system. So going up the hierarchy is helped by justifying conditions. Going down the hierarchy is performed by simulation. So it's always possible, because of the well definition of these systems, that you can take a system that's defined as a set of components that interact and simulate to generate the behavior of the system, which you can observe at the lowest levels. So the underlying principle is that systems that are morphic at any level imply that the associated systems are morphic at all lower levels. And that is the underlying principle to set up this hierarchy. We come to define computation and behavior. We see that we'll have input segments of time functions. Here, depicting a series of external events like spikes, here indicated with values 1, and between them null events or values of time that are mapped to a null symbol like V here. And the input events or input event streams cause output event streams, and we'll have a function of the output that is 1 or 0, depending on the pattern that we're recognizing. So we want to recognize a burst. And so there'll be output 1 for the beta function and 0 otherwise. So if there are no events, then the input segment is all feed for all instances of time. If there's one event, then there's some time instance in which omega t is 1. If we see a burst, then we define that as there being a sequence of instances that for which at each one there's a 1, such as 3 instance here, and that the spacing between them is small enough where we specify a duration u to be the amount of space required. And then otherwise, we have isolated events. If there's a subsequence of events that do not form a burst, we'll call that isolated events. And that's where at least there's one separation that is greater than the allowed maximum mu. I'll quickly show how to construct minimal realizations of functions using the derivative method borrowed from regular language construction. So here we have a tree, monoid, with expansion on branches representing null event segments and segments that end in 1 that are within the allowed duration, and those that are not within that duration. And we expand the tree where at each node we see whether we have come to a place where a function has been already defined. So for example, if a segment of length, any length with null events occurs from the empty initial node, then that function from there on is the same as the original. If a length segment that's longer than allowed with a spike occurs, then it comes to a node that obviously does not, whose function does not satisfy the original, and we can stop from there. If a spike occurs within the allowed duration, then we have a new situation and a new beta function because we need at least one such input to claim a burst. So following on from there, we get a second input that's within that segment, within that duration. We come to a new state, but from there on, if we get a null segment, we then can return to the original because from there's no limit on the number of successive spikes within the allowed interduration. So that follows the method for generating finite automata in the regular languages. But here we extend it to apply to time-based segments. And then We gather all the states that are distinguished as different and make the connections between them and get a minimal reduced realization. And we notice here that there are four distinct states that are required intuitively as well. And this then is a proof of the claim that this this automaton or this DEVS that actually is minimal in realizing the burst behavior. As an example of a DEVS atomic model, here's an elementary perception unit as defined in DEVS. As input ports activate, input event, and reset, and output ports activate and time out, and states as shown here, starting in a state, wait for activate, whose time advance is infinity, which means it will stay in that state until it gets an input, but will not change state otherwise. So once an input arrives, activate, it goes to a state wait for event and stays there for a time wait time. If there is such an input event that occurs within that time, then it goes to the state send response and stays there for a time response time, after which it puts out an activate and then goes to state received event where it stays forever until it gets a reset input and goes back to wait for activate. However, if there is no input event while it's waiting for an input event, then it transits after that time has expired to a state no event and outputs a notice that it's done so named timeout and stays in that state no event until it's reset. Now this can be described in DEVS with system theory-like notation and looking very much like automata or machine sequential machines. However, major differences are that there are time advance, there's a time advance function and two types of transition functions, external event driven transition and self or internal transition. And there's the output that occurs after transition is made. Now let's see why the DEVS formalism is most appropriate for neural net construction for behaviors. And we'll follow the example of the neural net just talked about and make the points successively here that neural elements, whether neurons or components that eventually are decided upon that characterizes the brain's cognitive information processing, they will be sending and receiving discrete signals. They will have to have states, discrete states such as the elementary perception unit, and they will need to have some long-term memory, which is also available in the DEVS model, atomic model concept. And we'll recognize that events and time play a fundamental role in their behaviors. so that time synchronization and bursts with the event durations and things like that, behaviors like that have to be represented and dealt with. Also, stochastic representation is required, and DEVS models accommodate that kind of Markov state representation. And then the interaction of components is well modeled by DEVS coupled models of these neural elements where the signals are sent discretely in time, non necessarily step fashion. And neural elements can be modeled by DEVS atomic models and, as indicated, Markov or so-called semi-Markov models. And the main distinction between this approach and typical neural nets is that we distinguish activation from I/O processing. We need different signals and different parts of the state realizations to capture the transmission of activation and the distinguish it from the input-output processing required to implement the interfaces of the behaviors. Now let's see why the DEVS formalism is most appropriate for neural net construction for behaviors. And we'll follow the example of the neural net just talked about and make the points successively here that neural elements, whether neurons or components that eventually are decided upon that characterizes the brain's cognitive information processing, they will be sending and receiving discrete signals. They will have to have states, discrete states such as the elementary perception unit, and they will need to have some long-term memory, which is also available in the DEVS model, atomic model concept. And we'll recognize that events and time play a fundamental role in their behaviors, so that time synchronization and bursts with the event durations and things like that, behaviors like that have to be represented and dealt with. Also, stochastic representation is required, and DEVS models accommodate that kind of Markov state representation. And then the interaction of components is well modeled by DEVS coupled models of these neural elements where the signals are sent discretely in time, non necessarily step fashion. And neural elements can be modeled by DEVS atomic models and, as indicated, Markov or so-called semi-Markov models. And the main distinction between this approach and typical neural nets is that we distinguish activation from I/O processing. We need different signals and different parts of the state realizations to capture the transmission of activation and the distinguish it from the input-output processing required to implement the interfaces of the behaviors. To give you an idea of how coupling of DEVS neural elements works to create coupled models, here is a cascade of EPUs that detects burst-like event streams. We see that an activate input coming in to the cascade is sent to the first EPU and transmitted downstream after each successive within time arrival of input event. If an event comes in too late, then a timeout is generated, and the timeout is sent to the output of the coupled model. Successive input events are sent to all EPUs and examined by at most one, the one that is activated. So here the input is distributed to all elements while the activation is transmitted in sequential form. And this is an example of how we distinguish the two kinds of inputs that other approaches do not. Now, the activate output occurs when successive inputs arrive while observing the inter-event space requirement. And finally, a reset is sent to all EPUs, again required one-to-all coupling that then resets the whole model. I'll illustrate very quickly the application of DEVS-based concepts to artificial constructed systems, including hybrid cyber-physical systems. A paper along these lines is cited below here. We can see that the design has a top-level discrete event layer with events and coordination and processing that along the lines that we've been discussing. And this is supported at lower layers by actual physics-based components that can carry out the commands that are generated by the higher level discrete event-based controller. And all this is developed within the DEVS formalism at the top level with the kind of sequence state diagrams that we've been discussing, but also including at the lower levels more continuous modeling that can also be represented in DEVS within a very efficient event-driven form. Let's talk about some conclusions. We've discussed an approach based on structural inference and climbing up the levels of system specification that was illustrated in the formulation of event-based burst detection. The justifying condition of minimality is used to assert that the example elementary perception unit is a homomorphic image of any realization of event burst detection. This justifies the claim that we can make that the EPU and other similar behavioral units that we haven't discussed here, that their states and transitions must in fact be found in any plausible biological realization or any realization of such behavior. This leads to questions such as, are brain elements with distinct input ports or equivalents to be activated, receive input, and to be reset to ground state? Are these found in actual neural level elements? So far, no neuron models, other than the ones we've discussed, have had these features. Are there output ports for downstream activation and signaling? Missed deadlines, as we've indicated with the timeouts and with the activation. Are these found in real neurons, neural units? Are discrete states with expectations for time-derivable events present in such elements? And do these units have the ability to inform others of the both the satisfaction and the non-satisfaction of these expectations? Likewise, are there brain elements for detection, reporting of non-event interburst durations with such minimality assertions? That is, we haven't shown here, but we also have the ability with DEVS elements to distinguish between proper interburst segments and non-event occurrences. Does the brain host pattern series composition coupling structures such as the ones we've indicated, which can coordinate activities and recognize groups of sufficiently close space events, and generally can coordinate activities in the manner that we have suggested? And that this leads to an architecture which is a hierarchical and modular, which conforms to that kind of architecture proposed by actual neuroscientists, and might look like this, using the diagram earlier to present the DEVS kind of network we've been discussing. Thank you very much for your attention.